Whether one is talking about the elegant Count Dracula or whispering Nosferatu's cursed name, the myth of vampires seems to be as undying as its ghoulish monsters. To live eternally and to feed off the blood of the innocent is humankind's dream of immortality turned into a nocturnal nightmare. In this episode, we are going to look at the vampire's deep-reaching historical and cultural roots, undigging its ghastly secrets, and shedding light on its egregious infestations. So grab your garlic necklace and your truest courage as we are venturing down into the crypts of age-old vampirism. Although our modern image of a vampire might be strongly influenced by today's books and films, the idea of so-called revenants or walking dead had already been known to people many centuries ago. Augustus Montague Summers, an English clergyman and occultist, researched their phenomenon in 1928 and wrote, "In all the darkest pages of the malign supernatural, there is no more terrible tradition than that of the vampire. A pariah even among demons. Foul are his ravages, gruesome and seemingly barbaric are the ancient and approved methods by which folk must rid themselves of this hideous pest." The word vampire itself was first used by an unknown Russian priest in 1047. Talking about a bloodthirsty, cruel devil, he described Prince Vladimir Yaroslavovich from Great Novgorod as an upir lichii. This old Russian term can be translated as wicked or foul vampire, and shares parallels with other Slavic languages. In Serbian, its equivalent is Vampyr, whereas the Germans used the word Vampyr. The English vampire made its first appearance in the mid-1700s in England. But before we are going to compare the manifold forms and cultural manifestations of vampires, there is an important distinction that needs to be made, as Paul Barber has stressed. In his book Vampires, Burial and Death, Folklore and Reality, he differentiates between the fictional and the folkloric vampire. While the first one prefers to drink blood from the neck of his victims and enchants with a tall, slender figure, the folkloric vampire resembles more of a beast. Aiming for the heart of his unknowing prey, he sucks blood from the chest and looks dark and slightly swollen. Just like the famous Count Dracula in Bram Stoker's novel, literary vampires are aristocratic and can be found in castles, while their folkloric counterparts are mostly deceased peasants dwelling in a damp and uninviting graveyard. Most of the time, vampires had left the world of the living in a sinful state and thus were rejected by the earth and the peace of death itself. Aimlessly wandering around in between the worlds, they were often described as suicide victims or morally questionable persons. Murderers, prostitutes, witches and sorcerers, but also simple drunkards, risk becoming vampires after their demise. When not having been buried correctly, even the most innocent people could be met with the frightful fate of a vampiric existence. The undead were often described as pristine, unrotted corpses, which was not a sign of sanctity, but rather of blatant wickedness. Since vampires did not have to upkeep a normal, living body, they needed to feed on blood to sustain themselves. In some accounts, like in the Russian ones, the so-called Revenants were even seen as flesh-eating creatures. As horrendous and blood-curdling these descriptions might sound, not all vampires in the Slavic tradition are savage beasts. A lot of them appear as tragic ghosts that suffered from an unjust fate. One tale, for example, tells of a young, married couple that enjoyed all the happiness life could offer them in the first few months. But shortly after the woman had given birth to her first child, she died. Her husband was desperate and grieved over her death, while his little son refused to eat the food he was offered and instead ceaselessly cried. Yet, as time passed, the baby miraculously began to thrive. One night, the husband could no longer contain his curiosity and decided to hide in the chamber of his little son. After darkness had fallen, he saw a figure slipping into the room and moving to the cradle. But when the man took his candle and cast light onto the strange apparition, he beheld his deceased wife peacefully suckling their hungry son. She looked up sadly as she saw the candle, for she could not endure the light. She walked wordlessly from the room without so much as a backwards glance. Then the father rushed to the cradle and found the baby dead. When Renfield, Dracula's manic servant, attacks Dr. Seward with a knife to cut his wrist and lick the blood from the floor, he repeats the words, "The blood is life," over and over again. It is not without reason that blood is considered the elixir of life, as it has been promising humanity immortality across the centuries. While some people today get their own blood cells injected to accelerate healing, the wish to gain eternal youth allegedly led Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian noblewoman from the 16th century, to bathe in the blood of young virgins. The Blood Countess, as she is also known as, was accused of killing hundreds of young girl servants for her own pleasure. Whether these allegations are true or not is up for debate. The myth, however, seems undying and has contributed to the many tales of vampirism. Since the earliest days of man, blood rituals and sacrifices were prevalent all across the globe. Warriors consumed the blood of their enemies to attain their strength, while the Hindu goddess Kali is said to have drunk her opponent's blood in an epic battle against the demon Raktabija. But if we look further, even in later Christianity, blood holds an important spiritual meaning. As a metaphor, wine represents the blood of Christ and therefore stands for a sacred substance that brings humans closer to God. Renfield's phrase, "the blood is life," also can be found in the book of Deuteronomy. There people are advised not to eat the blood of an animal, since it could be considered the actual life force that was reserved only to God. when connecting this knowledge with the sacrilegious behavior of vampires, it makes sense that these unholy creatures would seek their revenge in defiling the sanctity of blood, by drinking from the fountain of life and stealing it from God. They rebelled against heaven itself. Apart from their lust for blood and beastly urges, vampires can be seen as erotic creatures. In his anthology Vampires, Lord Byron to Count Dracula, Christopher Frayling writes that, alongside death and fear, the vampiric undead produce a certain sexual excitement without ever engaging in a mundane act. In chapter 3 of Bram Stoker's Dracula, Jonathan Harker is trapped in the Count's castle and gets confronted with his 3 eerie brides. Every line of that encounter seems to be drenched in sexual anticipation. Harker tells, "I was afraid to raise my eyelids, but looked out and saw perfectly under the lashes. The girl went on her knees and bent over me, simply gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive, and as she arched her neck, she actually licked her lips like an animal, till I could see, in the moonlight, the moisture. Lower and lower went her head. I closed my eyes in a languorous ecstasy and waited with beating heart." When one did not wish to engage with the troublesome vampires, there were plenty of ways to get rid of them for good. As it is so often depicted in today's books and films, the undead shy away from sacred artifacts and can be scared off by the cross, holy water, or simply some good old garlic. Oftentimes, vampires were dug up and reburied at the crossroads to leave them disoriented. If one were to take some more drastic measures, revenants could be killed by cutting out their hearts and by burning them. It was also possible to behead a vampire and bury his skull behind the body, all while making sure to place a wall of dirt between the two so that they would not join together again. Most famously, an aspen stake was the right choice when one aimed for the heart of a vampire. While one blow put an end to the undead's unnerving presence, 2 blows would revive it and kill the person who had attempted to strike against the creature. When looking at the various ways to fight vampires, the biblical figure of Judas Iscariot is a central element in the myth. Some even suggested that Judas could be seen as the first vampire, as he was acting as the ultimate antagonist of Christianity by his betrayal of Jesus. Besides that, many Christian symbols involving Judas also remind us of vampires. One example is silver, which the undead despise, and which Judas had accepted in payment for his treachery against Christ. In the end, Judas hanged himself on an aspen tree, thus sharing the fate of many vampires, who also had killed themselves prior and could be annihilated by an aspen stake. In many cultures across the globe, the mourning between the death of a person and their burial was considered to be a very dangerous period. The idea that the corpse could become possessed by a spirit or demon led to a large array of protective rituals. If a burial was not performed correctly, however, the deceased threatened to return as a monstrous figure. The oldest known bloodsucker is called a Kimu or a Dimmu and stems from ancient Babylonia. A Kimu can be translated with that which is snatched away, and stands for a person who becomes a blood-sucking demon after he has died of murder or by an accident. As we have discussed before, the majority of folkloric vampires have nothing in common with the late, elegant, aristocratic versions. They were ghastly beasts who often acted out of scornful revenge or wandered around as flesh-eating ghouls. The Russian Vampyr, for example, killed his victims in a crushing embrace, could spread diseases, and kill with the glance of his evil eye. Oftentimes being branded as a heretic, who had been expelled from the Russian Orthodox Church, the Vampyr stood close to the witches, just like the Romanian strigoi. In Ireland, the old tale of Aurtach offers yet another glimpse on a vampiric warlock. Aurtach was said to be a dwarf in the parish of Erigel in Derry, as well as a great magician. In his living days, he terrorized the people of the countryside as a vicious tyrant. Sadly, the hardship did not end when Aurtach died. The sorcerer dwarf returned more powerful than ever and swept across the land to drink the blood from his human victims. Only a chieftain named Fionn Mac Cumhaill was brave enough to slay him 4 times and to bury him upside down in a grave that was besieged by thorn bushes. Some people suggest that Bram Stoker might have drawn his inspiration for Dracula from the Irish legend of Aurtach. In China, the human body was believed to host 2 souls, with the first being a superior one that could detach itself from its shell and wander around on its own. Sometimes it was even able to take possession of another body. The second soul, on the other hand, was the inferior Pai, which could dwell in the body long after it had died. Similar to the beliefs in other cultures, a corpse that was animated by the Pai was commonly referred to as Jiangxi or a vampire. This restless ghost was described as having pale skin and long, sharp fingernails, which made it possible to rip off the limbs and heads from its unfortunate victims. While most vampires in European tales drink from the heart or the neck, the Japanese kappa hides in the water and sucks the blood of its prey through the intestines. On closer inspection, the idea of vampires transforming into bats seems to have its roots more than 2,000 years ago. In Mayan lore, the deity called Kamatzots looks half human, half like a bat, and embodies death with its nocturnal traits. People made sure to stay away from the caves that were thought to be Kamatzots' lair, and appeased the deity with various sacrifices. Although the tales of vampire attacks and hunts are largely settled in the realm of myths, there can also be found sources that treat them with stern seriousness. One such example is the English chronicler William of Newburgh, who lived between 1066 and 1098. He is generally regarded to be among the most accurate historians of his time and tried to record the events around him in a realistic manner. A few of his accounts refer to vampires or revenants and paint a haunting medieval picture. William of Newburgh tells of a deceased man in the English county of Buckinghamshire who returned to his wife one night and assaulted her with his crushing weight. Only when the church sent a written absolution to be placed on the cursed man's body, the vile haunting found a sudden end. Another vampiric account of William of Newburgh describes a cleric of Melrose Abbey in Scotland who preferred to enjoy his time out hunting instead of fulfilling his religious duties. After he had died, the ghost-like cleric returned to the abbey but was unable to enter its sanctity. When he started to pester a noblewoman in her chamber, a ranking monk was ordered to guard the grave of the Revenants. He was attacked by the living corpse and defended himself with an axe, which made the vampire flee back from where he came. The following day, the monk and his friends decided to burn the corpse and thereby broke its ill-fated spell. As we have seen, accounts of the undead can be found across the centuries, but it was only in the 1700s when a veritable vampire craze or hysteria began. Thousands of vampires were said to afflict their victims, mostly in the European countryside. Joseph Piton de Tournefort was the botanist of the French King Louis XIV. Although he was initially sent out to the Levant to collect exotic plants for the royal garden, Piton de Tournefort soon found a curiosity of a wholly different kind on the island of Mycone. In his Voyage to the Levant, he writes, "Nothing could be more miserable than the conditions of this island. All the inhabitants seemed frightened out of their senses. The wisest among them were stricken like the rest. It was an epidemical disease of the brain, as dangerous and infectious as the madness of dogs. Whole families quitted their houses and brought their tent beds from the farthest parts of the town into the public space, there to spend the night. In certain places of Europe, the inhabitants seemed so scared of vampires that they did everything to protect their lives from them at night. Many accounts and articles can be found about the big vampire epidemic from the 1700s. Among them the collection of Augustin Galmet, the abbot of Senon. It came as no surprise that the phenomenon of the undead began to occupy simple people as well as the great philosophers of the Enlightenment. Voltaire and Galmet tried to debunk the rampant myths with human logic and reason. In a rather cynical and disparaging manner, Voltaire comments on the belief in vampires. The French philosopher connects bloodsuckers with social issues and unjust tyranny. What? Vampires in our 18th century? Yes, in Poland, Hungary, Silesia, Moravia, Austria and Lorraine. There was no talk of vampires in London or even Paris. The true bloodsuckers did not live in cemeteries. They preferred great places. Kings are not, properly speaking, vampires. The true vampires are the churchmen who eat at the expense of both the king and people. As it is so very often the case, one extreme tended to foster the other, and so it came that the vigorous rationalism of the Enlightenment spawned the Romantic movement with its irrational feelings and morbid fairy tales. While the craze of the vampire plague in Europe had died off in the late 18th century, 100 years later, the undead re-emerged in the form of literary figures. Their popularity has stayed unbroken ever since then. Vampires, as we know them, were forged by books like Polidori's The Vampire and Bram Stoker's world-famous Dracula. In the last chapter of this episode, we shall take a closer look at the birth of these suave, sophisticated, and darkly charming figures. John Polidori came from a literary family and accompanied the famous British poet Lord Byron on his travels for a short time of his life. But unlike his friend, the lesser-known physician seemed to have stayed in the background. In his diary, Polidori writes, May 28th, went to Geneva, introduced to a room where about 8, 2 ladies. Lord Byron's name was alone mentioned. Mine, like a star in the halo of the moon, invisible. One fateful day in May 1816, a group of literary prodigies gathered at Lake Geneva in Switzerland. Although their actual destination was Italy, storms and the bad weather had forced them to make a stop at the Villa Diodati. The illustrious group contained no less a person than Lord Byron himself, paired with his mistress Claire Clairmont, Polidori, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, who found her inspiration for Frankenstein during the stay at the Swiss villa. Polidori partook in the games the group played to entertain themselves. Each one of the poets agreed to write a ghost story and to share it with the others, while Byron wrote a fragment of a vampire tale. Polidori initially came up with a skull-headed lady. It was only in 1819, after Polidori had been sacked as a physician by Lord Byron, that his story The Vampire, a Tale, was published in the New Monthly magazine. He had used the framework of Byron's fragments and thus was not credited as the author in the first place. A tedious fight with Lord Byron for the copyright ensued, and Polidori was acknowledged as the true creator of his novella in the end. Sadly, he gained not much success from it, and tragically died in 1821, at the age of 25, by an alleged suicide. Lord Ruthven, the vampire in Polidori's story, shares a striking similarity with Lord Byron and has shaped a new generation of undead revenants, which, opposed to their folkloric counterparts, tend to be rich, enchanting, and highly manipulative aristocratic gentlemen. Aubrey, the protagonist of The Vampire, recognizes the demonic nature of his friend Ruthven far too late, and has to witness how the women around him, including his sister, are being corrupted and destroyed by the blood-sucking devil. There were also a few later vampire stories that drew their inspiration from the folkloric monsters of the past. In his Penny Dreadful series, Varney the Vampire, James Malcolm Rymer describes a ghastly beast from Greece besetting innumerous human victims. Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, on the other hand, pays homage to the erotic vampire and transforms a woman into a mysterious and highly dangerous vampiric appearance, going after females. Similar to Polydori's fate, as an unsuccessful writer, Bram Stoker never received the fame he deserved after the 1897 publication of his groundbreaking novel Dracula. Having worked on the book for 7 years, Stoker likely had come across the Wallachian prince Vlad Tepes, also known as Vlad the Impaler. His nickname Dracula can be traced back to the Latin word Draco, which means dragon. This link does not surprise, as Vlad's father was part of the Order of the Dragon, a group that sought to defend Christianity against the invasion of the Turks. Only later, after Bram Stoker had died, the novel Dracula ascended to great fame. It inspired films such as the 1922's Nosferatu from Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau, in which the names were changed due to copyright issues with Stoker's widow Florence. Later films starred legends like Bela Lugosi or Christopher Lee as the leading part, and have shaped our image of vampires as cape-wearing, cunning creatures that could transform into bats. In conclusion, vampires, or the Walking Dead, as they were called by the people who full-heartedly feared them in the past, are a phenomenon that encompasses all times and cultures alike. From Chinese jiangxis to powerful Irish sorcerer dwarfs, there seems to be a vampire for every taste. However, it was only recently that the former Revenants have transformed into the attractive beasts we both cherish and dread today. Which stories about vampires did you hear as a child? And do you have a favorite tale to tell? As always, I thank you so much for staying here with me during this episode. Next time, we are going down a little bit of a different route, and we'll step into the realm of past, current, and future dystopias. Until then, stay happy and healthy, and don't let yourself be snatched by one of the undead.